Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Marlene Assalta with the Southern New Jersey Development Council. Welcome. I think you will find today's program informative, educational as well. Not all of you are members of the organization, so for those who are not, just a brief commercial. We are a nonprofit business association. It's our mission to promote the economic growth of South Jersey. We do that in many ways. As an example, we bring information to you similar to what you will see at in today's forum. And while I'm talking about today's forum, let me tell you, this is the product of the Energy and Environment Committee, and co-chairs, some of whom are on the program today. Some could not make it. But let me say thank you to co-chairs Susan Cohn from Atlantic City Electric, Ken Shepard from South Jersey Industries, Gene Fricks of Fricks LLC. And another big thank you to the Planning Committee for today's event. So let me acknowledge, and I know you're all on, Jennifer Cordes, Delworth Paxson, Gene Fricks, Ernest Fricks LLC, Bill Silverstein, GEI Consultants, John Ober, GZA Geo Environmental, Ryan Anderson and Ray Leeds, both from Langen Engineering, Stephen Kirshner and Rick Scheuer, both from Montrose Environmental. So thank you again. It's been an interesting planning experience. We do have a couple of housekeeping items. At the end of this program, we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. At that time, John McCarver will ask you to submit your questions through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. The panelists will address those questions in the order that they're received. And secondly, we are recording today's meeting, and we will share through an email link, the link to today's presentation. We also have a program book that includes contact information of today's attendees, so you'll be able to use that as well. And we also have sponsors. So let me also recognize today's sponsors. The presenting sponsors are GEI Consultants, GZA Geo Environmental, Montrose Environmental. Host sponsors today, Langen Engineering, Performance Marketing, and PSC&G. Oh, there you are. And supporting sponsor, Elect 825. There you are. So I will now introduce our moderators, and they will take it from here. So Ryan Anderson is the Senior Project Manager and has been with Langen Engineering since 2005. And Ray Lees is the Associate Principal with 25 years experience in environmental and civil engineering. I will turn it to them, and thank you. Looking forward to this program, and thank you all for joining us this morning. Ryan, Ray.
Thank you, Marlene, for the introduction. This is Ray Lee speaking, and I just want to reinforce and thanking everybody that took the time out to join us today. Again, my name and hello is Ray Lees. We will be doing the first presentation for the program today, entitled PFAS, What Are They and How Are They Regulated? I am joined today with my colleague, Ryan Anderson, who will be co-presenting. First, I'd like to recognize Ryan for assembling the slides that we will be using today. To reinforce Marlene's comment, questions will be addressed at the conclusion of the webinar. Next slide. So over the next 15 to 20 minutes, we will be going through and providing a basis for why PFAS has been found in the environment by briefly discussing the fundamentals about how PFAS came about, how it's incorporated into consumer and commercial product uses, a brief introduction in terms of the chemistry and the terminology and current regulatory positions at both the federal and New Jersey state levels. Following this brief introduction about PFAS, a panel discussion will commence thereafter. Next slide. So the scientific community, if you research the literature, has indicated that the PFAS family can contain well up to 10,000 different substances. However, there's approximately 4,700 PFAS chemicals registered today, of which, according to the EPA, 600 are commercially available. And out of those 600, only a small fraction, 60 to 70 PFAS chemicals to date have toxicity data available for review, and where commercial labs can positively identify them. By the way, we've seen similar emergent patterns of other emerging contaminants in this country, as well as public concern exhibited by other anthropogenic compounds. As an example, we went through the same emergence with PCBs, dioxane, chlorinated solvents are still emerging to some extent, as well as asbestos. PFAS are characterized by having carbon atoms linked to other carbon atoms that are bonded to fluorine atoms at mostly all of the available carbon bonding sites on the PFAS molecule. So that's an important concept to understand. The acronym PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances by definition. So in essence, PFAS is plural. So a polyfluorinated substance is essentially an incomplete fluorination of that molecule that can lead to degradation that could produce perfluorinated substances, which are much more stable and persistent in the environment. So no single chemical within the PFAS family can be both perfluorinated and polyfluorinated. On the slide on the right side, you see a tree, and on top of that tree, you see a chart, the bar chart, that basically includes two primary classes for PFAS, the polymers and the non-polymers. The non-polymers are the most commonly detected in the environment and have received the most attention relative to human health concerns, ecological concerns, regulations at the federal and state levels, and are included in most of the commercial available laboratory analytical list. So to provide some context for PFAS from a chemical and physical property standpoint, you have to understand how these compounds behave, because they're vitally important towards the understanding of how they behave in the environment in terms of fate and transport and exposure in the environment. So most PFAS compounds that are longer chain above C6, and C6 stands for 6 carbon atoms, are typically solid phase. The smaller chain, the C4, C6, could be liquid phase at room temperature. So the highly degree of fluorination that these molecules have impart a hydrophobic and oleophobic tendency for these compounds. And what that means is they tend to have lower surface tension, therefore they're extremely effective at repelling water and or grease. So the properties of PFAS are predominantly due to the unique properties of the carbon-fluorine bond, which is the strongest bond in nature. The functional groups, you'll hear people talk about the functional groups attached to the carbon-fluorine chain, provide the unique properties that are hydrophobic in nature for many of these compounds. Next slide, Trish. This is a time chart that outlines the emergence of PFAS over the past century. And originally, PFAS can be traced back to DuPont in the 1930s when they formulated PTFE, which is polyfluorinated ethylethylene. So the manufacturing of PFAS really started in the 1940s, but picked up momentum in the 1950s. So mid-20th century is when we saw the formulation and manufacturing of PFAS. The 1960s, we saw formulation of PFAS in the fire foaming production lines. AFFF is commonly referred to as a PFAS foam. In the 1990s, scientists started to detect PFAS, particularly PFOS and PFOA, in the environment and around the world, in the United States and over in Europe as well. So because PFAS can accumulate in humans, biota in the environment, over the past 2 decades, there's been a phase out of certain PFAS, such as PFOS and PFOA in the United States and other regions of the globe. However, as literature has indicated, production of PFAS has shifted to China and other parts of Eastern Europe. So in the United States, specific use of PFAS are still allowed, and they are manufactured in really modified mixtures that are less harmful to the environment. For example, non-fluorinated compounds or compounds with fewer carbon atoms. So this has gained a lot of public attention. So in the early 2000s, we saw a voluntary phase out of PFAS, and the classic example is the 2002 to 2010 timeframe, where 3M voluntarily phased out PFAS, PFOA, PFOS, and its precursors. So where does that bring us? So over the past few years, 2018 to present, we've seen the regulatory standards take place for groundwater and drinking water media, and also associated reporting requirements such as TRI. Next slide, please. This is an abbreviated list of consumer products where PFAS could be found in. And also PFAS can be found in rural areas as well as urban areas. However, the highest concentration of PFAS and exposures to PFAS are typically associated with industrial sources, and we'll get into that in a minute. So how are we exposed to PFAS? Question mark. Next slide, please. This is a rudimentary site conceptual model of an industrial PFAS site. The arrows that are indicated indicate different potential pathways that could stem from industrial uses of PFAS. However, keep in mind that a site conceptual model is unique to the site. So all these pathways and exposure points may or may not apply to the individual site. And for folks in the audience that are not familiar with site conceptual models, these models are used by scientists and engineers to characterize sites, the fate, transport mechanism, and exposure pathways for that particular site. I'd like to take note of the air deposition pathway that's shown on the top left corner of the slide. That is a hot topic and has received a lot of attention by scientists and the public. And that deposition can cause large PFAS impacted footprints that could impact many, many miles away from a particular emission source. The question typically comes up with why PFAS is found in air emissions. And it's a very complex matrix. It's typically attached to the particles and or vapor droplets within that air emission pathway. Next slide. The next few slides, we're going to go through the major sources of where PFAS as a source can be found at. This first slide is for industrial sites. We briefly looked upon industrial sites previously in terms of the site conceptual model. And industrial sites can be looked at in terms of 2 major categories. One where PFAS was manufactured as a raw product, formulated and manufactured. And the second is where manufacturing used PFAS as part of its components and incorporated into commercial or consumer products. Just note on the photograph to the right, you'll see a waterway in front of that industrial site. And at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, note that many of the industrial sites that we have in our country were located adjacent to waterways for the obvious reason of consumer and commercial product transportation, as well as water usage for the process within the facility. Next slide. This slide presents PFAS from a source either for fire training or response sites. AFFF foams are very well noted in the industry and in the media today. It stands for aqueous film forming foams. They're used for fire suppressants, to fight flammable liquid fires. As you see on the screen, there's many different locations of where these PFAS containing foams could be applied, either in commercial settings, chemical settings, airports, fire training facilities. The photograph on the right exhibits a AFFF foam that's being applied to a petrochemical fire at a facility. Next slide. This slide presents two major sources, potential sources of PFAS. And the reason why we have them on the same slide is they can be interrelated. They're both aggregates of society waste. People, domestic waste sent from homes, commercial industrial waste are sent to industrial landfills. So they're both sources or conduits for PFAS, in particular the industrial and municipal landfills as sources. Leachate is generated from most landfills and in most cases either treated on site and discharged to a wastewater treatment plant or direct discharge to a wastewater treatment plant. So wastewater treatment plants have not been and are not being designed to treat PFAS. So essentially they are a conduit for PFAS. And there's other conduits for PFAS into the environment as well from treatment systems, biosolids. So if a treatment system uses biological treatment as part of their unit operations, biological solids, i.e. sludge, is generated, and those biological solids have accumulated PFAS within them. And biological solids are routinely applied to agricultural fields, as it's shown on the bottom photograph, and or landfill covers. The other mechanism for PFAS to be liberated from a wastewater treatment plant could be through air emissions at the treatment plant or through the effluent discharge into waterways via their NPDES permits. Next slide. So with that, I'd like to transition to my colleague, Brian Anderson, who will speak about current federal and New Jersey state regulations. Brian?
Thank you, Ray. And thank you everyone for joining us. I'm going to go through federal regulations and New Jersey state regulations, as well as an update to a recent ASTM standard that we're all quite well aware of. And you see a lot here on the slide in front of you, a long list of items. I'm not really going to go through each and every one of the items, but just kind of highlight that in the early 2000s, activity really began on the regulatory front with the stewardship program, some TSCA regulations and establishment of lifetime health advisories. A call out that what you see for the health advisories, they're not regulatorily enforceable or legally enforceable. These are advisories. Most drinking water plants use them just to monitor. And then really things picked up in the 2013, 2015, 2016 era with the publication of the Unregulated Contaminants Monitoring Rule, third iteration, UCMR3, in which 6 PFAS compounds were included. And this rule is a program that EPA implements to monitor certain public water supply systems throughout the country to assess whether or not new compounds need to be regulated. So this really, the publication of this, as well as some other high profile news articles, things like that, really kind of kicked it into high gear and brought it to the public's attention, which drove a lot of activity. Some of it you could probably say was more strategic and just putting forth a good face. In 2019, EPA announced a national PFAS action plan. It laid out a roadmap of things that they were going to do. From that point, there wasn't really much action. I will say the federal government certainly did fund a lot of research, certainly looked at a lot of things on the technical side, toxicity. So there was activity going on behind the scenes, but from a regulatory standpoint, there really wasn't much action. Late in 2021, EPA re-announced a new rebranding of what I'll say was the original National PFAS Action Plan as the PFAS Strategic Roadmap, which included a roadmap for how they were going to regulate, what they were going to do, establishing a national testing strategy, expanding PFAS testing under the 5th iteration of the UCMR rule. So that came about the end of last year. They initiated as well at the end of last year the rulemaking process to classify PFOA, PFOS, the two main ones you heard Ray talk about, as well as another PFAS compound, PFBS, perfluorobutanoic substances or butanoic acid. There's different iterations there, as well as Gen X, which is the next iteration of shorter carbon chain perfluoride PFAS compounds. That kind of became the substitute chemistry when the PFOA and PFOS were phased out. Their rulemaking process was to establish these as RCRA hazardous constituents, which would allow for enforcement under the RCRA program, allowing EPA to direct cleanups, direct investigations in a much more timely manner than going through other rulemaking processes. In addition, the strategic roadmap has laid out a path forward. If you go to the next slide, please. Of other actions that are going to happen this year and into next year, which includes updating the Toxic Substances Control Act with probably more PFAS compounds, more stringent regulation, anticipation of additional health advisories to be issued for the Gen X and PFBS compounds, which were not on the first iteration, updates to the NIPD's permitting program to reduce the amount of PFAS in surface water and groundwater discharges around the country. So we're already starting to see that in New Jersey, and I'll touch on that. Proposing primary drinking water MCLs for PFOA and PFOS. They, I believe, put together the proposal and are working through that now and are expecting come 2023 that there will be issued primary drinking water MCLs. The rulemaking process takes some time, so the look ahead is 2023 for those, as well as they have begun the process of designating these compounds, specific PFAS, they haven't said which, but likely PFOA and PFOS to start, as CERCLA hazardous substances. And that's important from a property transaction perspective, as well as a cleanup perspective from Superfund programs. Next slide. So in New Jersey, what you saw was a lot of strategy from the federal government, not much concrete action from regulations, which left the states to pick up the ball and regulate these compounds and give industry and give consultants like myself and Ray and others on the line here something to act upon. So what has New Jersey done? And what New Jersey has done is really started in 2020. They established PFOA, PFOS, and PFNA, which are different perfluoroalkyl substances, on NJDEP's hazardous substances list. They have, sorry, pardon me, I have a note here as to exactly which. They have updated the Safe Drinking Water Act in 2020 as well to require PFOA and PFOS testing for public community and public non-transient, non-community water systems. Certain sizes, these have specific definitions that now have to test for these on a monthly basis or whatever their permits may require. They updated the Private Well Testing Act, which requires the testing of all private wells on property transactions that are on a property for PFOA, PFOS, and PFNA, and that was required as of December of last year. Drinking water standards were issued, as well as groundwater quality standards. So for PFNA, PFOA, and PFOS, you can see them there on the slide. They're relatively low. We're talking parts per trillion here, 13 and 14 parts per trillion. And as recently as January of this year, they issued an interim groundwater quality criteria for total chloroperfluoropolyether carboxylates. This is a new class of compounds. It's a group of PFAS compounds, so they're issuing it as a total. As I understand it, there are no labs certified by the state of New Jersey to run this analysis yet. It is relatively new iteration, and it was in response to a specific site need in the state. Soil remediation standards, which are a big gray area right now for us in the investigation and remediation world, have not been published yet, though they are in development, and we do anticipate them in the relatively near future. NJDEP has indicated they're closing in on issuing that. Emerging contaminants guidance. They've issued guidance on how practitioners, consultants, and responsible parties in the state of New Jersey that are cleaning up contaminated sites have to address emerging contaminants. That's expanded beyond just PFAS, but for the sake of our discussion, you have to look at and evaluate these compounds, do an assessment as to whether or not you think they might be related, akin to a due diligence, but a little bit more in New Jersey specific. And what NJDP has said to the LSRPA and to other practitioners is that they will continue to issue new regulations for substances, PFAS substances, on an as-needed basis, based on research, new toxicity data that comes out, as well as the needs of the state. So this is a continuing and growing area. They're going to do it as they need to. And they're continuing to grow the regulatory program. And this is extremely important to understand as we go into the next few slides, or the next couple of slides, to really understand why you need to be looking ahead when you're doing your due diligence, when you're looking at redevelopment projects, things like that, is looking to the future as well as looking at what you have to deal with right now. So next slide. There's a lot that Ray went through, a lot that I have gone through. There are some fantastic resources out there. In addition to talking to your consultants and your environmental attorneys, there's the ITRC, which has a really robust regulatory guidance document that many of us on the call here have participated in developing, along with the regulatory agencies. EPA has a good informative roadmap webpage that lays out what their plans are and what their intention is, and you can keep track of where they are in that process. New Jersey has several links. You see a couple of them there. They have a web page with information. They have an emerging contaminants page that talks about how to deal with them in an SRP program, as well as a publication for typical industry sectors that have handled PFAS based on NAICS codes. That publication is not something they're using to target industries, but it is a piece of information that they have published that is available for use and available to look at as well. Next slide. So really all of that regulatory projection, where they're going, the fact that it's continuing to grow, plays into due diligence quite a bit. And there was the recent update to the ASTM 1527-13 standard, which is now the ASTM 1527-21 standard that was published in November 2021. Currently, that has not been adopted by EPA for conformance to the all appropriate inquiries rule, which would give a CERCLA innocent purchaser defense. But that review is ongoing. And once that is adopted, essentially the new standard becomes what you have to follow for an innocent purchaser defense. In that standard, there is a specific discussion about emerging contaminants, and PFAS are specifically discussed in that. I believe it's Appendix X of the standard, where it is identified as a non-scope item. So it is not a CERCLA hazardous substance, therefore it cannot be an in-scope ASTM item when you're doing a phase 1 due diligence. So it cannot be a REC, cannot be a CREC or an HREC, or a de minimis condition even. Once that changes, which you saw before, the EPA is on the process of getting those certified as hazardous substances, and considerations from the states you're working in. New Jersey has them listed as a hazardous substance within the state. Once that happens, they can become a REC. But since they can't be right now, they can be identified as a non-scope issue in our reports. They can be identified as a business environmental risk. And this can play into transactional due diligence quite a bit. And it's really important that you're aware of this. You don't want to be going into a property knowing that 2 years down the line, you may not have been protected from a liability that you should have been aware of. So it's important to look to the future of where these regulations are going, understand the risk and liability exposure, consult with your professionals, talk between the clients and the consultants, as well as your environmental attorneys and your real estate attorneys and that are assisting you with the transaction. It's extremely important to know that as you're going into these into this period of kind of a gray area right now, where we're trying to protect liability and continue with our process as normal. So with that, I think I'm going to hand it back to Ray to wrap us up. And I appreciate everyone for joining us on this presentation. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you, Ryan. And Excellent general overview of the regulatory atmosphere out there in the country and the state of New Jersey. With that, we'd like to transition to the panel discussion. I'd like to introduce John Ober, who is the moderator for the panel. John is a vice president and associate principal at GZA Geoenvironmental, with over 30 years of experience in the environmental investigation and remediation markets. It is my pleasure to turn the next portion of this program over to my colleague, John.
Thank you, Ray. And thanks to both you and Ryan for a great intro to this complex world of chemistry for PFAS. I'd like to invite our panelists to turn their cameras and microphones on. Our first panelist is Jennifer Cordes, who is a partner with Dilworth Paxson and former Deputy Attorney General for the state of New Jersey. We also have Rick Scheuer, Senior Project Consultant with Montrose Environmental, a licensed site remediation professional who has 35 years of experience in the environmental industry. And Bill Silverstein, a Senior Consultant with GEI Consultants, a licensed professional engineer with 35 years of experience in environmental consulting. So we've got about 100 years of environmental consulting on this panel, and a former deputy attorney general. So I think this is going to be pretty informative. We want to discuss how PFAS is going to impact PFAS compounds may impact specific industries, how to account for PFAS when entering a project investigation, how to address the stringent remediation standards we're going to be forced to deal with, and adapt to the changing rules that are on the horizon. I'm hopeful and optimistic this discussion will provide helpful guidance for municipalities, developers, and anyone who's planning a future redevelopment of a property. I want to start off by hitting up our consultants. Let's start with Rick Scheuer. Rick, why should our membership care about PFAS in conjunction with real estate transactions?
Thanks, John, and good morning to everybody. Well, we need to realize that PFAS is regulated, at least for 4 compounds in New Jersey, and it's most likely going to be further regulated by industry. So as far as due diligence and transactions, we need to be cognizant of what the liabilities are at a potential property with these compounds. And there are a couple of different ways that we can look at doing that. It was discussed following the phase 1 ASTM in New Jersey under certain programs such as the ISRA or the Brownfield. We need to look at doing them under the Spill Act requirements, which is a preliminary assessment for liability. And then other ways that we might want to look at it is through insurance requirements and packages that we'd be able to do it. But to answer your question, John, is that we need to look at whether or not these compounds are there, present, and potentially would end up having to be remediated.
Bill, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess I would add that there's certainly the question of what is, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, exactly what is required to be an innocent purchaser now in purchasing a property. We talked about ASTM and talked about the fact that New Jersey preliminary assessment, is the Spill Act standard for an innocent purchaser, and those requirements are changing all the time as different chemicals are added to the state and federal hazardous substance lists. But there's also the question of future liability. If you buy a property now that has some other PFAS compound that is not one of those 3, and you go to sell your property or get a bank loan or development or put in a water supply for your development, a few years down the road, we have to kind of look at these compounds, assuming that there will be a longer list that's regulated, that there will be standards for soil as well as groundwater, as well as surface water, and possibly other media. So there's the question of, what do you need to do right now to be an innocent purchaser, and what are you really going to own if you buy something?
Yeah, good points, both Rick and Bill. Jennifer, anything to add from the legal aspect on why our members might care about PFAS?
Well, good morning, John. I think that sort of to echo what Rick and Bill have both said, and even what Ryan sort of alluded to towards the end of his presentation. I think we're all aware of the fact that the whole purpose behind conducting due diligence is to sort of get your arms around what potential issues may exist with a piece of property or actually do exist. And the whole idea is then to go into a property purchase with your eyes open so that then you can make a business decision as to whether or not that property remains the right property for how you intend to use it. And then take whatever steps you can to minimize that risk if you decide to go forward. And that can take place by conducting all appropriate inquiries under both CERCLA or the Spill Act in terms of setting up a bona fide purchaser or innocent purchaser defense to both statutes, CERCLA and the Spill Act. But it also allows you to perhaps set up some other mechanisms in the course of the transaction, given so many uncertainties with whether or not PFAS are included, not included, what are the standards. And we can talk about that a little bit further on, but just sort of, for example, if you decide that, well, this is the best property for what I want to do, and I have a risk tolerance for it, then perhaps you set up some protections in your transaction documents that sort of say, well, hey, seller, we want to make sure that PFAS are included in the definition of hazardous substances, even if it's not clear what's required under CERCLA or the Spill Act, to ensure that that then falls within the umbrella of perhaps some indemnification or seller reps and warranties that might give you some additional contractual protections, given, like I said, the uncertainty with what's going on with how the substances are regulated.
Oh, that's great. That's a nice segue into my next question. I'll start with Bill this time. If someone's decided that this is the right property for them, and they want to decide whether they need to set up legal protections, as Jennifer has suggested, what do people have to look for if they're concerned about PFAS at their properties? Or prospective purchase?
Well, as we've talked about, a little bit so far in the course of doing, whether it's a phase one or a PA, the ITRC has some really good resources on the types of, industries and sources of PFAS, in the environment and that might be found at a site. So it's important to become familiar with that, and it's a very long list. There's everything ranging from the fact that PFAS is kind of ubiquitous in the environment and, without a real source at your property or even at the neighboring property, if you test, and we'll talk about when to test, but you might just find some at a low level. It might be above a regulated level. You can also have, some more specific sources, whether it's an actual, industrial source, Teflon coating cookware or something that sort of sounds more like you would find these things. But there's a whole range of other industries, in textiles, metalworking. So in terms of really the same issues that you would look at for, for any other compound, this is part of the theme for today, is this is just like any other compound, except we know less about it and people are less familiar with it. And those add more risk. So, the buyer, the consultant, the attorney might all be less familiar with some obscure property use that you never really paid much attention to before, didn't sound very industrial. but could be important from the standpoint of, of PFAS and as was also mentioned, even things like land application. If you look at farmland, you might be thinking about, generally might be thinking about the possibility of pesticides. Now, if you're looking at a piece of farmland, you should be looking at whether, biosolids were used there, and whether there could be PFAS. So it's the same thorough look that you would do for any other chemical, except that it's new. And so it's easier to miss things. And there really is a long list of sources to pay attention to.
Yeah, that's a great point, Bill. Rick, would you like to add to that?
Sure, thanks. And to reiterate sort of what Bill said is there are a lot more industries and usage that PFAS has been done in factories. At first, everybody was just sort of saying, if it was a fire training center or if you had a fire, then look for it. But there's many more of these applications to do. But the other thing that I think is really important, especially with these compounds that are so ubiquitous, is you need to really look around your potential property that you have and really look at the chances of those being more of a source and or providing background information because unfortunately you're most likely going to find these compounds. That's been the case for me. So understanding before you just focus on your facility, but look around you for potential sources that could be impacting the one that you're interested in.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
If I could add just one thing to that, and I appreciate that Rick mentioned fires because I completely left that out. And it's, in general, we kind of have, industrial sources and fires are two completely separate things. Chemical fires tend to be at industrial sites. There's less of a chance that foams can be used at a residential fire or something where water works just fine. But pay attention to that. The other thing I was going to say that Rick reminded me of is when you're looking at even at neighboring properties, if you go and look at the New Jersey DEP GeoWeb and look and see, is there a mapped plume next to my site? If there's a chlorinated solvent plume next to your site, there's a much better chance it will have been discovered by now and mapped. If there's a big PFAS plume next to your site, it may be that no one has ever tested there yet. And, you will be shorter on information even when you go to look at those neighboring properties. So you may have to look closer at what they really did and not so much at, whether there's a known release there.
Yeah, that's a great point, Bill. I'm sure there's plenty of sites where in the state where we've got PFAS plumes that just haven't been found yet, and we're going to find them in the next few years. Jennifer, switching gears a little bit, what happens when as Ray and Ryan indicated in their presentation that the EPA is considering or has started the process to designate PFAS substances as hazardous. What happens once that occurs? Will they automatically become RECs, recognized environmental conditions under the ASTM standard?
So I think that once EPA decides to include PFAS as a hazardous substance, that's going to then open the door for there to be different kinds of RECs identified based on the presence of PFAS at the site or in the manufacturing components that were made at the site. And once that's done, that then triggers the different liability and cleanup requirements for responsible parties at both Superfund brownfield sites, and then allows EPA to eventually pursue enforcement actions related to that. What's different and what is sort of, as I think Ray and Ryan sort of characterized it as a gray area in New Jersey, is that these substances are already on DEP's hazardous substance list. And DEP has actually taken the position that under the Spill Act, the Water Pollution Control Act, the Solid Waste Management Act, and the Air Pollution Control Act, they are either hazardous substance or pollutants or solid waste or air contaminants. And therefore, the liability provisions of those statutes are necessarily triggered. What makes that complicated is if we don't have known remediation standards for soil, or we have some for groundwater, but if we don't have them for soil, how can the agency then say to a property owner or responsible party, you have to clean it up, if we don't know the baseline to which we're trying to clean up that substance to? So that's sort of the unknown factor in all of this. But once hazardous substances are then amended to include PFAS, then that allows either EPA or the state to then pursue cost recovery actions, or third parties to pursue contribution actions. And sort of given the history of how CERCLA and the Spill Act have evolved, it's probably likely that those will be retroactive, and you'll have to go back in time to when, before the hazardous substances were actually so designated. So the potential for liability is certainly a strong one, given sort of the trend that we've been seeing. And I think that sort of further supports what I would counsel my clients to say is, if you should include PFAS in your preliminary assessment or phase one, and then work with your consultant to sort of figure out what that means if you're a current property owner or a prospective property owner, and then figure out next steps based on whatever that current position DEP is taking or EPA is taking with regard to those substances.
That's great. Thanks. So we've done our phase one or our preliminary assessment, and the question that I think is on everybody's mind, and I'll start with Rick on this one. How does someone know when they should actually test for PFAS? Do we do the phase two or the site investigation to take the next step?
All right, thanks, John. And this is certainly subjective at this point. First thing is, if you have found that the facility has used or processed materials that are for hydrocarbons, then certainly that is an indicator that then you need to figure out where those materials were handled and stored, how they were discharged, and even looking at fugitive emissions and things, and then testing certainly those types of media as you move away from those facilities, and whether that's just water or it's surface and soils, even though we don't have standards for those things. The other thing is, I would not be sampling necessarily if I didn't find a definitive use of these materials, or had some kind of incident that I really felt that foams were used for a fire or something for it. I would again be really looking at what is around the area as well, and trying to determine then, do I have a potential receptor that I would be liable for? And the closer a receptor could potentially be, then I would be more inclined to be looking to see if I think there's something on my property that could be leading to that receptor. And those are the two areas that I really would focus on the most when it comes to whether or not to actually sample. And then we can talk about the types of sampling and methods and things.
Bill, your take on that?
Yeah, again, this is, the procedure is kind of like every other chemical. It's, do the thorough, PA or phase one, determine if there is, an apparent, storage or use or discharge of the material, on the property. You could have a building that has a, an installed foam fire suppression system with a foam storage tank. And, you could look at that tank and determine that, it's well maintained, it's never leaked, it's never actually been discharged for a fire. And, theoretically, you could make the decision that, PFAS was used on the site. There's no evidence of a release. I don't need to test. But it's those same questions, that are done, that are done for any other chemical. The one thing we didn't touch on, we talked about kind of doing a PA or phase one from due diligence before going into a property. There's also, the times during remediation that these have to be looked at. So, for example, DEP, has determined that with emerging contaminants, these need to be looked at before each key phase document submittal. So before submitting an RI, before submitting a remedial action report. Again, that doesn't mean the testing needs to be done then, but it does mean that for a property that you already own or are already cleaning up for, in whatever role, that the preliminary assessment for these particular compounds needs to be done. And again, that's just another time that you would potentially look at testing. That still doesn't say that you need to test as opposed to determining not to test.
Yeah. So we've gone through the process. We've chosen this perfect property. We've done our phase one, our preliminary assessment. We had reason to believe that there was PFAS. There might have been PFAS used at the site, or maybe that there's an off-site source. So what happens when you've detected? What happens then? What do our poor property buyers or owners required to do? And I'll start with, let's go back to Bill.
Okay. Well, I guess one piece that I wasn't sure if we were answering this in the last question or this question, we kind of skipped over the, what should you test for? So
Great point. Yeah,
we can talk
bring that in.
We can talk about that as well as then what to do about it. But when you look at what to test for, so if you've decided that that it is necessary to test, there's the question of whether to only test for the specific compounds that are regulated, or specific compounds that are known to be used at the facility, because DEP's, again, this is not specific to this chemical, but just general, general guidance. If you, if you think you spilled something, you're supposed to test for it. You're supposed to look at the risk. If it's at a level that, if it doesn't have a standard, but it's at a level that poses risk, you're supposed to calculate your own site-specific standard and go ahead and clean up to that. So if you, and I guess that's where the new PFAS standard came from, is we were talking about for the interim standard, a particular site with the release of something that wasn't one of the 3 regulated compounds. That doesn't mean that it's unregulated. It means you have to develop a standard for it. And that's where that 4th state standard came from. So my point was, you have to look at the question of whether to test for a longer list or only the things that are regulated. You should certainly include any compounds known to be used at the site. There's certainly an argument for keeping to a short list. The argument that you don't want to generate data that you don't know what to do with. Why generate data for something that doesn't have a standard? On the other hand, if you, as we had said, if you say buy a property now, only test for 3 PFAS compounds, you determine no cleanups needed, you don't find anything, and in a year or 2, you go to sell the property and there's a longer regulated list, and now you've missed something, you may want to look at a longer list now. There's also, I guess, the question from a forensic standpoint, that if you're looking at a long list of PFAS compounds and you test, on your site and up gradient from your site, you can get a better feel for whether you're finding the same thing. Is it really from the same source? So there's those considerations in, in exactly what to test, and also which media to test. DEP just developed the soil test method, and as we said, there's still no soil standard. So there's a question of when do you want to test soil at your site? I've worked at one property that was had essentially a fire training area. It was actually a fire extinguisher demonstration area, which had a clear hotspot in groundwater. It's a place that was likely to be a source, where you would think you would have something in soil. And developer wanted to build a warehouse over it. So the issue was, if we think we should dig up this source, we'd like to do it right now. Only there's no soil standard, but if we were to test, we would find numbers that are higher than some of the numbers that states are kicking around. And that was a situation where there's no soil standard. We attempted to create our own and actually ran into the issue that if there's no test method, which there wasn't at the time, you can't create no approved test method, I should say. I mean, you could test for PFAS compounds in soil, but without a state approved test method, the state cannot approve a site-specific standard. And so you run into that issue of, if you really think you have a source and you really need to remediate and you actually want to test soil because you want to remediate soil, there's a bit of a quandary as far as exactly how you do that and some steps to work through with your consultant. But then there's the question of, now what do I do? And, at least for the regulated compounds, those are reportable if they're above that standard. There's the question under New Jersey due diligence of, what's reportable in terms of due diligence versus remediation. And we could talk about that for hours. So I think we're going to skip that for today. At least for those three, at least those three are reportable, and DEP has allowed those to be reported as a new case if they're discovered in the course of an ongoing remediation.
Rick, your take on that?
Where, and my previous answer, I made a comment that, I've got to really have some kind of evidence that I really want to go before, sampling. And one of the things is, as a practitioner, we want to have reliable, reproducible, and defensible data. And unfortunately, the regulatory community is putting us into a box where they're asking us to use analytical methods that aren't already approved or approved for the media, and because of that, laboratories aren't certified for that. They end up having to come up basically with their own SOP, which can vary. And so can you compare, one data to another? They're asking you to use a drinking water method for other media. And now we have a new method that's coming out that's draft, the 1633, but first of all, it's not an approved method, and then, we don't have laboratories that are certified. And then on top of it, we don't have standards that the laboratory can use to then verify their results too. So like this new compound that's out there, there is no standard that the commercial laboratories can go and do an analysis for. So for those reasons, there's a lot of times not to start collecting data that can't be reproducible and might not be defensible. And, the UCMR 5 that's out, you'll have to do 537.1 and 533. And they have a lot of compounds that are the same in those. We just got results back from a drinking water place that the 537.1 is below the standard and the 533 is above. And in my professional opinion, the 533 would actually be a better analysis because it's an isotope. So any analysis that you're doing, I would always tell people to use the isotope analysis for it. But so when looking at the data and what you have to do, I strongly suggest doing the broader range That broader range can indicate different types of the way PFAS was generated or manufactured. They have different patterns if it was done by electrochemical fluorination versus a telomerization, process. The other thing to look at is there are a lot of precursors that will convert to the more stable compounds later, and you want to be able to take a look and see if those are there, because that can give you false indication of where sources are or may not be in the future. So it's a little bit, John, maybe I went too far on that, not sure.
No, that's fine, Rick. Nice summary of the laboratory issues that we're dealing with. I want to get back to Jennifer. We're talking about, what do we analyze for? Do we analyze? And we found it. Now we found it. We've got to clean it up. And we could probably spend a whole nother seminar on, what the technologies that are being developed are for cleaning it up. But my question to you, Jen, is can you speak a little bit to the subject of the ability to recover the cost of these remediations, which are invariably going to get quite expensive in the very near future?
Sure. But first, if I can, I want to address something that both Bill and Rick have been talking about. And I think it's something that may come into play sort of while these standards are still evolving. And the question is, if you are interested in purchasing a property, you do a preliminary assessment or a phase one, and perhaps you have reason to think there are PFAS at the site or have been used at the site or maybe off-site, then I think a real question is going to be, is your current property owner going to allow you to do a phase two or site investigation based on the uncertainty? And what happens if they don't? That then becomes a little bit of a risk analysis for you to determine whether or not you want to go forward with your purchase, or perhaps, work with your consultant to push back a little bit and say, hey, listen, these are the results of the reports. This is why we think we want to do some additional sampling. So you may need to sort of build that into your transaction, initially in, perhaps a contract, purchase and sale agreement that sort of allows you the ability to do further testing and sort of craft that based on what you may know or learn about the past history or operations at the site. So I just think that that's something that could become an issue until we have a little bit more direction from the agencies.
Yeah.
But in terms of sort of recovering costs, I think we're right back to the point I made earlier with, if they're not a designated hazardous substance, that could affect your ability to recover those costs in a contribution action against the responsible party that may have put those substances in the ground. Now, that being said, there may be other mechanisms, and I haven't looked at this in detail, that you may be able to pursue for nuisance or trespass or something like that. But your best avenue, until we know and get some more direction from the agencies, might be to pursue sort of whatever grant or loan programs the state offers, although navigating them can be somewhat complicated and complex. And DEP has an entire website devoted to, or a section of its website devoted toward, what those opportunities might be, under what statutes, what media, what compounds. So that may be something that you can pursue, or perhaps you have to build that in to what the purchase price may be if you decide to purchase or you decide to sell, and kind of factor in the fact that there may be a cleanup required, or maybe you need to, increase your deposit in order to go forward with the additional sampling that needs to be undertaken. So again, as with so many things that we've talked about, it's a little bit fluid. I would always counsel to, speak to an attorney, and of course work with your consultants to sort of understand what your risk might be for your particular piece of property that you're either considering or do own.
And how does the difference in the federal versus New Jersey? I mean, the New Jersey declaring them hazardous substances in the state, but the Fed hasn't done that yet. How does that play into that whole sort of scenario of trying to be able to protect your ability to recover costs?
So under the Spill Act, there are certain cleanup responsibilities and liabilities for owners of property, operators of property, those who have arranged for the disposal of hazardous substances, generated hazardous substances. There's a whole category of what the state or DEP considers a responsible party. And it's a pretty broad term. It says in any way responsible is the term, and that's been interpreted, as I said, fairly broadly. And once a substance is considered a hazardous, once a compound is considered a hazardous substance, it can then get sort of looped into that. And then under the Spill Act scheme of liability, you become responsible for it. And as such, that allows a third party to then pursue that responsible party for recovery of costs that they incur. Now, you have to be able to sort of demonstrate the nexus. It's not a hard and fast, but whereas, in CERCLA, if we don't have that designation, you don't have that liability or cleanup responsibility, which is why I think DEP's designating these substances as hazardous substances have kind of laid the groundwork for both DEP and third parties to be able to pursue that. But again, we're right back to but what standards? If you've incurred costs, are they going to be considered cleanup costs under the definition of the Spill Act as well? So it's sort of it's a vicious cycle, as we've been talking about the unknowns.
Yeah. I have one last follow-up, and I'll throw this out to anybody who wants to take a stab at it. If we find, as you mentioned, the only place that New Jersey has standards for it is in groundwater. If you find it in your groundwater, are you then compelled to look for it in other media, soil gas, indoor air? Bill, Rick, Jennifer, any insight on that?
Well, DEP at the latest SRAG meeting had discussed that they have been evaluating the SPLP analysis for PFAS. Their concern was that that apparatus all uses glass, and glass is something that they are concerned with, that you're not getting then the proper results because PFAS can cling to glass for the analysis. But so far what they've looked at is they think that it's negligible in the lab, and so there is a potential that they would come out with a SPLP approval method for the soil to determine whether or not it's going to leach to be able to the groundwater. And that's probably the closest that we're going to come to having something. There is a lot of work being done for a air standard or an air method, OTM 45, because they do believe that a lot of the PFAS is being emitted and transmitted and transported to different properties through air mechanism. So I think we're going to see that coming. I don't know if we're going to see anything for vapor intrusion or a subslab gas sampling at the present moment, being that the majority of these compounds are not that volatile. It's actually have to be emitted through a stack or particulate matter to really move them. So that's what I see potentially coming down.
At least there's one piece of good news in this whole thing. Thanks, Rick. John, I'll turn it back over to you to moderate any questions that we may have come in.
Certainly. Thank you, John. Thanks to all
Before I do that, I want to say thank you to Rick, Bill, and Jennifer for doing a great job.
Thank you.
And I would echo that too, John. Thank you. Go through a couple of questions we have here, and I'll throw it out here. is the EPA also looking to regulate PFAS in air emissions? And we'll go over a general roundtable. I don't know if Ray and Ryan want to join back in on some of these that may touch some of your areas too, but feel free to weigh in. But again, that was, is the EPA looking to regulate PFAS in air emissions?
And I'll jump in and say yes. And there's a lot of studies that are taking place right now with the, as I said, the OTM 45 analysis. And EPA, is coming out and going to ban incineration of PFAS materials here. And that's sort of a stop measure till they can figure out air quality measurements and sampling for it. So the answer to it is yes, it's going to be coming down. I think we're probably a good couple years away though.
I would echo that on Rick's part. They certainly are looking at regulating air emissions, and they have been doing a lot of studies. So yeah, I think it's fair to say it's coming if it's not already being pushed. I know TRI reporting, you're seeing TRI reporting and right to know reporting, which have a lot of air emission based reporting requirements. So,
and that gets into some of the idea of what you speak of, some of this fugitive or this migrant kind of emissions that start at one stack and end up downstream, if you will, somewhere else, and trying to track them down and keep tabs and get back to the source for, as we call it, like the cost recovery is always something we'd like to get to. Okay, next question here. Will they be issuing a MGW PFAS standard? And we've heard, this individual heard about direct contact coming soon. I'm assuming that might make sense to you folks. MGW
Well,
standards?
yeah, that's the migration to groundwater standards. I think right now that they're going to probably go with allowing the SPLP for site specific until maybe they can get enough data and then come up with maybe an MGW standard would be my guess.
Okay, let me skip down to this one. I got put here. What kind of liability is there with a property owned by a municipality to its residents? And that's an interesting one. I like to hit on a bit. If you guys could talk about how municipalities might be impacted by these things, maybe not directly, but indirectly, but still impacted nonetheless.
Well, I mean, we could do an entire seminar just on, potential spill act or circular liability, certainly. But just in a broad sense, there is no reason a municipality couldn't be liable for cleaning up any substances that are on property that it owns. I would sort of qualify that with saying that there are certain exceptions for which DEP specifically won't pursue a municipality if, for example, it would otherwise qualify for some form of innocent purchaser status and or obtains the property in a somewhat, I don't want to say involuntary manner, but if they acquire it via foreclosure or via a taking, or there are a host of categories for which a municipality may not be actively pursued. So I would say that, it depends. At least from that standpoint. I don't know if the consultants can speak a little bit more technically with regard to PFAS specific.
Anybody else want to jump in on that?
I can add an example of site that we run into in the fire response action. They used AFFF. The local fire department came out and utilized it. The township, the local fire department, they're protected under existing law. Emergency responders, you can't go after them for the use in an emergency response. The property owner is required to deal with that. That said, fire training centers that are owned by counties, municipalities, those are certainly sources that are being looked at, and those entities are considered responsible parties in many instances. Those aren't emergency response actions. And back in the day, these foams were used for training practices. So they can certainly be held responsible in the certain circumstances, but I think for one of the things that we see is emergency response. There's acts on the books right now that are protecting those responders and the entities that they're part of from being held responsible or going after as a third party in those actions.
And I know that that's come up as a point of contention for a private party, because you know, if you own a building and it's on fire, what's your choice? Do you actually want the fire company to come out and spray PFAS all over it? Would you rather let it burn? Would you like them to try water, you know, and see how that does? That's not necessarily going to be up to you, but the first responders are protected.
To your point, Bill, there are many types of fires that water just doesn't work. You know, I have a site where it was an automobile recycling facility for many, many years, and they had a series of tire fires at this particular facility. And you know, tire fires are very difficult to put out, and AFFF is one of the few things that works on them. So now we have a PFAS problem at this site. But the alternative is to let the tire fire burn. And frankly, back in those days when they were using AFFF a lot, we weren't concerned about the risks of PFAS.
You know, one other thing that we kind of mentioned just in the regulatory summary at the beginning, talking about, you know, water supply testing, that we didn't really get into later, is the idea that as, you know, more and more people are required to test water supplies, whether it's the private well testing at sales of properties, or whether it's the public supply testing that's required more frequently, you know, whether it's municipality or private ownership, you may own a property and the next door neighbor, you know, you go through the whole issue of, do I test, do I not test, and decide whether you should or you shouldn't, but then there's a house next door and they test. So we're also in a point in time where data is going to start appearing in places, and, you know, people will have to deal with it. Is that house down gradient of, you know, of your site, which didn't have any particular reason to suspect PFAS, but, you know, the first direction that they'll point is up gradient.
Yeah. And if it is coming from your site, is it coming across your site from a site that's up gradient of yours? These pollutants can get very large.
Right.
And John, one of the other questions we got coming in here, kind of on that note too, is PFAS being included in insurance policies? How is it kind of taken into, and I know Jennifer talks about risk management and things of that nature at one point, but how is this accounted for? Can people be insured against some of these things if they don't even know it's there yet?
At this point, if you really don't know it's there, and there's no particular reason to suspect that it's there, but there's reason for everyone to be a little bit concerned because you could find it anywhere, then you're in the perfect spot right now to buy insurance, because you know, with a pollution legal liability policy, there are carriers that will sell that, which will not exclude PFAS. If it's, you know, generally a clean property, there's no reason to suspect it. If you're trying to buy a property that, you know, used it, and you have already tested and found it, it's too late to buy insurance. If you have a property that you think used it and no one has tested yet, insurers are smart enough to ask some questions and realize that they probably shouldn't insure that either. But if we're talking about, you know, these kind of risks that it could pop up anywhere, that you can protect yourself from and buy insurance for. I've also seen it in a more complicated scenario. I mentioned cleaning up a fire training center where the developer wanted to buy pollution legal liability insurance. There was reason to suspect that it was there, or maybe by the time they were talking to the insurer, we had already tested and found that it was there. And they actually wrote that policy excluding the known PFAS, but stating that if it was cleaned up to a standard which we put in the policy, and in that case, we used, you know, a draft California soil cleanup standard, you know, and the existing New Jersey groundwater cleanup standard, that once that source area was cleaned up to those standards, that the rest of the site actually would be insured. You know, in case anything else came up, or in case the standard was lowered further. So there is the opportunity for insurance, particularly on a site where, you know, there's no real reason to believe it's there, but we want to protect ourselves.
All right, anybody else want to jump on that one?
Well, I'll answer for Jennifer, which is to have an attorney read the policy.
Well,
Of
and,
course.
and just to embellish a little about what Bill has stated, in my opinion, over the last 3 or 4 years, the carriers are becoming more educated. States that don't have active PFAS regulations, I think there's room under PLL policy to not have exclusions in the endorsement. But states that are very active, California, Bill, you mentioned, I find it very difficult for carriers to not exclude PFAS in a general term as an acronym and not specify the various substances or constituents for PFAS, which we try to do within the policy endorsements. So I think it's helter-skelter out there in terms of the overall landscape, in terms of how carriers are applying that emerging contaminant definition within the policy.
Greg, thank you. Let me throw one more out at you guys here. And I'm going to looks like a good one here. But given that New Jersey is infamous for its industrial legacy, will property owners be able to use the upgradient plume exception, and by the analogy, up air emission distribution, to not do investigations and cleanup, or will they have to seek redress from these manufacturers? We saved the best for last. Who wants to jump
Take
in?
a stab.
Thank you, John.
You'd have to prove that it's coming from off-site. You can't just not sample and say, if there's PFAS on my site, it's not coming from my site. So that typically requires, collecting samples at the upgradient property boundary and making sure that, you don't have higher concentrations leaving your site than you do entering your site. So it's not, you won't be able to get away without investigating, but your investigation can be used to prove that it's not yours. I know that's a partial answer, but that's kind of where we're at right now. As far as remediation, again, if you're forced to remediate for whatever reason, well, I guess in this case it would depend. If you're doing the remediation for convenience because you don't have time to wait for litigation to get your cleanup covered and you want to redevelop their property, then you may have to shell out the money and then seek redress from your upgradient source. But if you don't, then the DEP will eventually go after that upgradient source, provided you've proved that it's not coming from your site.
Or if it's a property that you're just in the course of investigating as part of due diligence, then
Right.
you know of the existence, you're going to have to build that into your development and your sort of overall business model and trying to factor in the costs of cleanup and construction. And maybe you go back to the current property owner and say, hey, you got to cut me a break on the price because this has now opened a door. I'm still willing to go forward, but it's going to, maybe come to these guys and say, hey, give me a ballpark on what it might cost me. And then you go back and sort of renegotiate the deal. Now, whether your property owner will do that or not, that now they know there's a problem. So they either sell it to you and work with you or try and sell it to someone else, and they're going to find themselves in the exact same position.
Right. They'll have to disclose that when they go to sell it to someone else.
Great. Bill, and let me we're quickly going to wrap this thing up, and I don't want to fall short of forgetting to mention, we do have some folks on here who are interested somewhat in water. And I know we talked about the soil aspect, a lot of this, but this issue is just as big for wastewater, groundwater. I mean, there's a whole nother seminar that can be done on the water side of this.
Drinking water.
Correct. Okay. So that's something, but this is being monitored and looked at, and obviously something we should maybe come back to if people are interested in a later point, because there was a lot I got out of this, just talking about the soil side of that. So I want to thank everyone for a great discussion here today, and hope that it was helpful to at least getting a lot of folks to start understanding PFAS and what they are doing in our environment, how they got here, and some insight and hopefully some connections with some of the people you've heard offer some of their expertise today. And I certainly want to thank you folks your time and your expertise, for everything you've given to make this come true. And I really appreciate it. I've spent some good time with you guys learning a lot, and it's not an easy thing to learn about it. You've been very patient. So thank you for that one. But again, we want to thank GEI, GZA, Montrose Environmental, Langen Engineering, Performance Marketing, PSE&G, and ELEC 825. Love all our sponsors for their support in presenting this morning's program. Without that support, that's what makes these programs possible. That and the help of our members, like the panelists today. So I thank you again for that. To our speakers, again, it's with your support that we can provide these interesting and entertaining and informative content to folks on stuff that as it comes out, as it evolves. As we said, with water, there's more to have added with this, another bite at the apple, if we will. I think we've indicated here there's a lot more coming down the pike with PFAS going forward on the state and federal level. So it's going to be an ongoing conversation that I, again, really appreciate you guys helping put a baseline understanding for me and other folks out there. And I just want to remind everyone, we'll distribute a recording of today's webinar along with the presentations and our digital program book. I want to apologize for anyone that got in a little late. We had a couple of technical issues with some of the logins, but we'll still send you the full presentation and program book. With that, I thank everyone and wish you a good day.
Thanks, John, and thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you.